There's a ballroom on Lenox Avenue that used to host the most elegant celebrations in Harlem, a place where jazz bands played till dawn and dancers moved like silk across polished floors. But on the night of Marcus Silk Henderson's 32nd birthday in August of 1936, that ballroom became a slaughterhouse, the music drowned out by gunfire, the elegant crowd transformed into a stampede of terrified bodies scrambling for exits that suddenly seemed too few and too far away. But here's what the newspapers never reported, what the police deliberately buried in their investigation files, what even the survivors whispered about only in the safest spaces years later. The shooting wasn't random violence spilling into an innocent celebration. It was a carefully planned execution disguised as chaos. And the real target wasn't Marcus Henderson at all, but someone standing 3 feet away from him. Someone whose death would shift the entire balance of power in Harlem's underworld, and whose survival that night, purely by chance, or divine intervention depending on who's telling the story, would spark a war that lasted 18 months and left bodies scattered across 6 neighborhoods. And there's one more detail that transforms this from just another violent incident into something far more sinister. Someone inside that ballroom, someone Marcus trusted enough to invite to his birthday celebration, had given the shooters precise information about where their target would be standing at exactly 11:47 p.m., which means the betrayal came from within, from the inner circle, from people who'd broken bread and shared drinks and sworn loyalty just hours before they helped orchestrate a massacre. Let me take you back to a Harlem that was living in that strange, suspended moment between the worst of the Depression and the approaching storm of another world war, a neighborhood that had survived economic collapse and was now thriving in defiant celebration of its own resilience and creativity. The year was 1936, and Harlem was the cultural capital of Black America, the place where the Renaissance had bloomed, and where music and art and literature were being created at a pace that made downtown critics simultaneously envious and dismissive. The Cotton Club was packing in white audiences who came uptown to watch black performers they'd never invite into their own neighborhoods. The Savoy Ballroom was hosting dance competitions, where the Lindy Hop was being perfected by young people whose energy seemed limitless, despite the poverty many of them lived with daily. And underneath all this cultural flourishing, underneath the jazz clubs and the speakeasies and the late-night poetry readings, ran the darker currents of the policy rackets and protection schemes and territorial disputes that kept certain people wealthy and kept many more people terrified. Marcus Silk Henderson was one of those people whose position in Harlem's social hierarchy was complicated and contradictory in ways that tell you everything about how power functioned in this neighborhood. He ran a successful funeral home that served the community with dignity and respect, gave families payment plans when they couldn't afford proper burials, showed up to every church function and community meeting looking respectable and concerned. But he also operated as a numbers banker for the policy racket, collected protection money from businesses on a 6-block stretch of Lenox Avenue, and served as a mediator between different factions in Harlem's underworld when conflicts threatened to become too visible or too violent. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of figure who existed in the gray zones where legitimate and criminal, community leader and predator, protector and threat, all blurred together until you couldn't separate one from the other. His 32nd birthday celebration was meant to be the social event of the summer, an invitation-only affair at the Royal Ballroom that would bring together Harlem's elite, the successful business owners and entertainers, and numbers operators and political fixers who formed the neighborhood's real power structure, regardless of what the official authorities recognized. The invitations had gone out 3 weeks earlier, printed on expensive cream-colored cardstock that announced the event's exclusivity. Dress code was formal. Men in tuxedos or their best suits, Women in evening gowns that showed off the latest fashion, even if those gowns had been sewn at home from patterns copied out of magazines. The entertainment would feature Duke Ellington's orchestra, which Marcus had paid a premium to secure for a private engagement. The food and alcohol would flow freely. No expense spared. Because birthday celebrations at this level weren't just parties. They were demonstrations of power and status, announcements that you'd arrived and intended to stay at the top. If you want to understand how celebrations became battlegrounds in Harlem's underworld, how social gatherings turned into stages for rivalry and retribution, make sure you're subscribed, because we're going deep into the culture and psychology that made violence erupt in spaces that should have been safe. The tension that would explode that night had been building for months, though most of the people filling the royal ballroom were blissfully unaware of the specific conflict simmering beneath the surface festivities. The immediate cause traced back to a territorial dispute between Marcus Henderson's operation and a crew run by Vincent "Quick" Morrison, an ambitious young operator who'd been expanding aggressively into areas that Marcus considered his established domain. Quick had been undercutting Marcus's protection rates, offering businesses cheaper deals while simultaneously spreading rumors that Marcus was losing his grip, that his operation was vulnerable, that smart operators should align with the rising power rather than the fading one. These weren't just business disputes. They were challenges to reputation and status, the kind of disrespect that in Harlem's underworld couldn't be tolerated without inviting further encroachment. But underneath this immediate conflict ran deeper currents involving the arrangement Bumpy Johnson had negotiated with Lucky Luciano's commission years earlier. That deal had established frameworks and territories, had created a structure where certain operators paid tribute and received protection in exchange. Marcus Henderson had been one of the operators who'd accepted this framework, who'd agreed to pay his percentage and work within the system. Vincent Morrison represented a newer generation that resented those arrangements, that saw the commission's cut as unnecessary taxation, that wanted to operate independently even if that meant risking conflict with both the established black operators and the Italian mafia backing them. The birthday ball ambush would be where these competing visions of how Harlem's underworld should function would collide with devastating violence. The evening began exactly as planned, with guests arriving in their finest attire, the women's jewelry catching the ballroom's chandeliers and creating small constellations of reflected light, the men's polished shoes clicking across the dance floor as they greeted friends and rivals with equal warmth. Because in public gatherings like this, maintaining appearances was essential regardless of private animosities. Duke Ellington's orchestra started playing at 9 p.m., and the music filled the ballroom with that sophisticated jazz that made even the most ordinary movements seem elegant and purposeful. People danced and laughed and drank champagne that Marcus had imported from France at considerable expense, and for those first hours the celebration felt exactly like what it was supposed to be. A moment of joy and accomplishment in a neighborhood that had fought hard for every moment of joy it could create. Marcus himself was in his element, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who understood that hosting a successful party required constant circulation and attention. He greeted arrivals at the door, made sure everyone had drinks, introduced people who should know each other, diffused potential tensions with jokes and careful diplomacy. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit him perfectly, his processed hair gleaming under the lights, his smile genuine because despite everything else, the criminal enterprises, the threats, the constant calculating, he genuinely loved bringing people together for celebrations like this. His wife stood beside him for much of the evening, elegant in a deep red gown. Her presence a reminder that Marcus had legitimate family and community ties that extended beyond his underworld connections. But scattered through that crowd were people whose presence carried different meanings, if you knew what to look for, if you understood the coded language of who stood near whom and who avoided eye contact with whom. Vincent Morrison's crew hadn't been invited. That would have been deliberately provocative. But several people who'd been seen talking with Quick's operators in recent weeks were there, and their attendance created a network of potential information flow that Marcus either hadn't noticed or had noticed and calculated wasn't worth making a scene over. There were also people present who owed debts to Marcus, who'd accepted his help in the past, and now might resent the obligations that help created. And moving through the crowd with particular purpose was a man named Thomas Reeves, one of Marcus's oldest associates, someone who'd been with him since the beginning and who nobody would have suspected carried information back and forth between Marcus's operation and Vincent Morrison's crew. Around 11:30, the energy in the ballroom shifted subtly, the way crowds can sense something coming even before they understand what it is. The band had taken a break, and recorded music played over speakers, while musicians refreshed themselves and the dancers caught their breath. People were clustering in conversation groups, some heading outside for cigarettes and cooler air, because the ballroom had grown warm with body heat and exertion. Marcus was standing near the main bar with 4 of his key associates, discussing business in those careful euphemisms that let them talk shop without being explicit about what they were actually saying, and 3 people away, positioned perfectly by accident or by design, stood Raymond Ray Fletcher, the real target, though nobody in that ballroom knew it yet. Raymond Fletcher didn't look like someone whose death was worth orchestrating an ambush. He was in his late 40s, heavy-set, dressed in a tuxedo that was slightly too tight because he'd gained weight since buying it years ago. He ran a relatively small operation, just 3 policy banks in a neighborhood that wasn't even considered prime territory. But what made Raymond valuable, what made him dangerous depending on your perspective, was his relationship with the Commission. He'd become Lucky Luciano's primary source of intelligence about what was happening in Harlem, the person who reported on conflicts and betrayals and opportunities. And Vincent Morrison had recently learned that Raymond had been feeding information to the Commission about Quick's independent operations, had been setting Quick up for enforcement action that would have eliminated him as a competitor. The birthday ball offered a perfect opportunity for retaliation, a crowded space where a shooting would create maximum chaos and confusion, where escape routes were plentiful, where the real target could be eliminated while everyone assumed the violence was directed at the host. The shooters entered through the kitchen at 11:43 p.m. 3 men wearing service staff uniforms they'd stolen earlier that evening from the catering company handling the event. They moved through the service corridors with confidence that suggested either careful planning or inside knowledge of the building's layout, and they positioned themselves at 2 different points that provided overlapping fields of fire into the main ballroom space. One carried a Thompson submachine gun hidden under a long serving cloth. The other 2 had pistols tucked into their waistbands, and they waited for the signal that would tell them their target was in position and vulnerable. The signal came at 11:47 p.m. exactly, Thomas Reeves adjusting his tie in a specific way that the shooters had been told to watch for. Raymond Fletcher was standing at the bar, his back partially turned, engaged in conversation with Marcus Henderson and 2 other men. The positioning meant that any shooting directed at Raymond would likely hit multiple people, would create the kind of chaotic bloodbath that would dominate headlines and police investigations while obscuring the actual assassination buried within the larger carnage. What happened next lasted maybe 15 seconds, but felt eternal to everyone trapped inside that ballroom. The first shooter stepped out from the service corridor and opened fire with the Thompson, the weapon's distinctive chatter so loud in the enclosed space it was like reality itself was being torn apart. The sound paralyzed people for maybe 2 seconds before panic took over. Those precious seconds where brains tried to process what was happening, where the music and laughter transformed into screaming and the instinct to flee overrode everything else. The bullets swept across the bar area, shattering glass and wood and flesh with equal efficiency. And Raymond Fletcher went down immediately, hit multiple times in the back and head, dead before his body finished falling to the floor. But the chaos meant the shooters couldn't confirm their kill, couldn't verify that they'd hit the right target, so they kept firing as people stampeded toward the exits, as women's evening gowns tangled around their legs, and men shoved each other aside in desperate attempts to escape. Marcus Henderson had dropped to the floor the instant the shooting started, his survival instincts overriding the paralysis that froze others, and he was crawling toward cover behind the bar while bullets punched through the air where he'd been standing seconds earlier. 2 other men near the bar were hit, one fatally, the other with wounds that would require months of recovery. A woman running for the exit caught a stray round in her shoulder and spun sideways, her scream cutting through the other sounds of panic and pain. The second and third shooters fired into the crowd more indiscriminately, not targeting anyone specific, but creating maximum disruption to cover their retreat. Tables overturned as people dove for cover. Chairs became obstacles that tripped fleeing guests. The chandeliers swung crazily from the vibrations and concussive force, creating moving shadows that made the scene even more nightmarish and disorienting. Multiple people actually, were shouting, "Get down!" and "He's got a gun!" and other warnings that came too late to help, but expressed the human need to do something, anything, in the face of incomprehensible violence. And then, as suddenly as it started, the shooting stopped. The attackers were already moving back through the service corridors, disappearing into the kitchen and out the back exit, where a car was waiting with its engine running. The entire assault from first shot to escape took maybe 40 seconds, and in that time they'd killed 3 people, wounded 7 others, and transformed a celebration into a massacre that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Now, I need to hear your theory about who gave up the information. Was Thomas Reeves the betrayer? Or was there someone else inside Marcus's circle feeding intelligence to Vincent Morrison's crew? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because understanding how these betrayals functioned tells us so much about loyalty and survival in Harlem's underworld. The immediate aftermath inside the ballroom was chaos of a different kind than the panic during the shooting. People were crying, screaming, calling out names, trying to find friends and family in the confusion. Others were trying to help the wounded, tearing evening gowns into makeshift bandages, applying pressure to bleeding wounds with hands that shook so badly they could barely function. The band's instruments lay scattered and abandoned, a trumpet rolling slowly across the floor until it hit a spreading pool of blood and stopped. The smell of gunpowder mixed with expensive perfume and spilled alcohol created an olfactory nightmare that survivors would remember decades later. That particular combination of scents instantly transporting them back to this moment. Marcus Henderson emerged from behind the bar, unharmed physically but visibly shaken, his tuxedo dusty from the floor, his processed hair disheveled. He moved immediately to where Raymond Fletcher's body lay, checked for a pulse that wasn't there, and his face went through a series of expressions that revealed his racing thoughts. Shock, grief, calculation about what this meant, fear about what would come next. Because Marcus understood immediately what most people in that ballroom didn't yet realize. This wasn't an attack on him despite happening at his celebration, and that meant someone had used his birthday ball as cover for an assassination, had violated the sanctity of his event, and put everyone he cared about at risk to settle a score he hadn't even known existed. The police response was predictably corrupt, and incompetent in equal measure. Officers arrived within 10 minutes, sirens announcing their approach long before they entered the building, and immediately started treating everyone present as suspects rather than victims. They separated people into groups, took statements that contradicted each other because trauma fragments memory and perspective, and made no serious attempt to pursue the shooters who'd had plenty of time to disappear into Harlem's maze of streets and alleys. The detective who eventually took charge of the investigation was known to be on Vincent Morrison's payroll, which meant the official investigation would go nowhere productive, would generate paperwork and dead ends, while the real story remained buried beneath layers of deliberate misdirection. The news spread through Harlem with that supernatural speed that tragedy always traveled, carried from person to person through a network of phone calls and messengers and people appearing at doorsteps with expressions that announced bad news before words were even spoken. By 2 a.m., everyone in the neighborhood knew about the shooting at Marcus Henderson's birthday ball. By dawn, competing narratives had already emerged about who was targeted and why, with most people assuming Marcus was the intended victim because it was his celebration, because he was the prominent figure, because understanding that Raymond Fletcher was the real target required knowledge of dynamics most people didn't have access to. The community response revealed Harlem's complicated relationship with the violence that periodically erupted from its underworld conflicts. On one level, there was genuine horror and grief. 3 people dead, 7 wounded, dozens traumatized, all at what should have been a joyous celebration. Parents kept their children home from school the next day, not because of any credible threat, but because the sense of safety had been shattered and needed time to rebuild. Churches held prayer services, ministers talking about senseless violence, while carefully avoiding any specifics that might implicate congregants who operated in gray zones between legitimate and criminal enterprise. But underneath that horror ran currents of anger and calculation. People understood that this attack had implications, would trigger retaliation, would potentially escalate into open warfare that could turn any public space into a potential battlefield. Shopkeepers considered closing early or hiring additional security. Mothers planned routes that kept their children away from corners where crews congregated. And operators throughout Harlem's underworld were reassessing alliances and vulnerabilities, wondering if they'd be next, calculating whether to flee or fight, or negotiate their way to safety. Marcus Henderson's response to the attack was surprisingly measured, which revealed either wisdom or weakness depending on who was analyzing his actions. He didn't immediately launch retaliatory strikes against Vincent Morrison's operation, didn't declare war or make public threats. Instead, he reached out to the Commission's representatives, requested a formal sit-down to discuss what had happened and determine appropriate responses. This decision angered some of his younger, more aggressive associates who wanted immediate violent revenge. But Marcus understood something they didn't, that Raymond Fletcher's assassination at his birthday ball had been a commission problem as much as a personal attack, and bringing the Italian mafia into the resolution would multiply his enforcement capacity while avoiding the appearance of weakness that unilateral action might create. The sit-down happened 3 days after the shooting, in a private room at a restaurant on Mulberry Street that Lucky Luciano controlled. Marcus presented his case carefully, that his celebration had been used as cover for an assassination, that the attack had killed one of the Commission's intelligence sources, that Vincent Morrison's operation was becoming a destabilizing force that threatened the arrangements everyone had agreed to. The Commission's response was swift and unequivocal. Within a week, Vincent Morrison had been arrested on weapons charges that would put him away for 5 years. 2 of his key lieutenants disappeared, their bodies never found, but everyone understanding what their absence meant. And the message was clear to anyone paying attention. Using celebrations as ambush sites violated unwritten rules, killed innocent people alongside targets, and would be met with overwhelming force. But the deeper damage from the birthday ball ambush couldn't be erased through enforcement actions or negotiated settlements. The attack had shattered something fundamental about how Harlem's underworld functioned, had proven that no space was truly safe, that celebrations could be turned into slaughterhouses, that betrayal could come from the closest circles. People stopped hosting large public events, worried that gatherings would create opportunities for attacks. The social fabric that had made Harlem's cultural scene so vibrant and interconnected began fraying as fear and suspicion replaced trust and community. Thomas Reeves, the man who'd given the signal to the shooters, disappeared 2 weeks after the attack. His body was found in the Hudson River a month later. Though the official cause of death was listed as drowning, and no investigation pursued the obvious questions about how a strong swimmer ended up in the river with his hands and feet bound. His betrayal had been discovered through patient intelligence work, people noticing patterns in his movements and communications, others coming forward with information once they understood the stakes. And his death served as a reminder that loyalty violations in this world were met with permanent solutions, that some betrayals couldn't be forgiven or forgotten. For the survivors of that night, the psychological scars proved more enduring than any physical wounds. People who'd been in the royal ballroom developed anxiety around loud noises, avoided crowded spaces, woke from nightmares replaying the chaos and terror. Marriages strained under the weight of trauma that partners couldn't fully share or understand. Some left Harlem entirely, relocated to other neighborhoods or other cities, trying to escape memories that followed them regardless of geography. The ballroom itself never hosted another major celebration, the space too haunted by what had happened, and it eventually closed and was converted into a warehouse where no music played and no dancers moved. The birthday ball ambush of August 1936 became a dividing line in Harlem's underworld history. A before and after that shaped how subsequent generations of operators thought about vulnerability and celebration, and the costs of conflict. It proved that violence could erupt anywhere, at any time, regardless of how careful or connected or respected you were. It demonstrated that betrayal could come from the most trusted circles, that loyalty was always contingent and conditional, that self-interest trumped friendship when stakes were high enough. And it established precedents about retaliation and enforcement that would govern how conflicts were managed for years afterward. What's remarkable when you study this period through oral histories and archival records is how the mythology around the attack evolved to obscure the actual strategic dynamics. Most tellings focus on Marcus Henderson as the target, emphasize his survival as proof of his toughness or luck, and miss entirely that Raymond Fletcher's assassination was the actual objective. This mythological drift reveals what people needed to believe, that prominent figures like Marcus were important enough to target, that survival meant something about character rather than just positioning and chance. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more disturbing. Raymond Fletcher died because he talked to the wrong people, and 20 other casualties were collateral damage to that single calculated murder. The legacy of the birthday ball ambush extended far beyond just the immediate participants and victims. It changed how celebrations were planned and secured, with hosts hiring professional security and limiting guest lists and conducting searches that would have seemed paranoid just months earlier. It accelerated the professionalization of Harlem's underworld, pushed operators toward more sophisticated intelligence gathering and operational security, because the amateur approaches that had worked in earlier eras proved fatally inadequate. And it reinforced the Commission's power over Harlem's criminal landscape. demonstrated that Italian mafia enforcement could reach into black neighborhoods with devastating efficiency when their interests were threatened. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you understand that Harlem's history is filled with moments that were simultaneously tragic and revealing, events that expose the deeper structures and tensions shaping the neighborhood's evolution. This is real history, documented through police records and newspaper accounts and the testimonies of survivors, the actual human costs of conflicts that history books often reduce to simple gang warfare. If you want to hear more stories from this era, want to understand how these events shaped Harlem's trajectory through the rest of the 20th century, make sure you're subscribed and check out the next installment in this series. We're committed to telling these stories with the depth and respect they deserve, honoring the victims while understanding the complicated dynamics that produce the violence. Hit that like button, share your thoughts about how communities recover from trauma like this, and join us next time as we continue exploring one of the most fascinating and heartbreaking periods in American urban history. The story continues, and every chapter reveals new layers of complexity that challenge our assumptions about crime, community, and survival in spaces where both coexisted in uneasy balance.